Who's been with us for these previous 2 weeks? Give me a wave if you've been here the previous 2 weeks. A good number of you. Wonderful. So we've been journeying through Psalm 139. A little mini-series, I guess, and this evening is our last instalment from that psalm. If I was brave, I'd ask those of you who are here if you can remember what the titles were of the first and second week, but I'm not. So I'm not going to ask. Week 1, we looked at the reality of God in our midst. Week 2, which was last week, we thought around how God knows us. And today, our final installment would have the title something like this: God continues his work in us. God continues his work in us. But before I read to you part of the reading we're going to look at this evening, I guess I want to pose a question to you. Do you believe that God is continuing his work in you at the moment? Are you aware of God at work in your life at the moment? Or not? I'm not asking you to tell me the answer, but I am asking you, and I'm asking myself the same question, to, in a sense, answer that as honestly as you can within your heart. And my guess is that some of you will think, absolutely, I'm aware that God is continuing his work in me at the moment. I'm aware of God at work in me at the moment. But I'm guessing that some here this evening might think, no, actually, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where God is in the midst of all of this at the moment. I'm not sure if God is continuing his work within my life. Just hold on to that honest answer. So I'd like to read to you Psalm 139, if you've got your Bibles. I'm going to start and read at verse 13, and I'm going to stop reading at verse 18, then we'll pick up the rest of it a little bit later on. So firstly, verses 13 to 18. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God? How vast is the sum of them? I try to count them. They are more than the sand. I come to the end. I am still with you. If Psalm 139 teaches me anything, it teaches me this: that God is not just merely interested in us. That God doesn't just have a passing interest in us as human beings. But that God created us. That God made us. And the implication of some of the words that we have there, words like formed and woven, suggest kind of a bit of a hands-on activity going on here from God. Some of you know and some of you don't know that when I was finishing my A-levels, my intention, and I had a place, was to go to art college and study ceramics. Pottery was my thing. It's funny that I'm now working in the potteries and doing no pottery at all. But pottery was my thing. And so I knew what it was to form things. And I loved nothing more than to get I'm going to have to put my book down to get my hand on a lump of clay and to knead that clay and to kind of throw the clay to soften it and to get it into a place where it could actually be formed into what it was you were going to create, what it was you were going to make. But once you had actually made your creation, which actually took quite a long period of time, For some of the things I made, it would take weeks. And you had to pause, and you had to be patient, and you had to wait for the clay to get to a certain hardness before you could add to it. And then you had to hone it, and you had to do all kinds of different processes with it. Then you had to let it dry out, then you had to fire it, and then you had to glaze it, and then you had to fire it again. It's a long process. But certainly when it came to forming something out of clay and making it, it was an absolutely hands-on process. You couldn't just sit back and watch it happen, otherwise it would just stay as a lump of hard clay. You had to get in there, you had to work with it, and you had to work hard to create something as beautiful as possible. We have been formed. We have been formed. God has worked in us, on us, to form us. We have been woven together. God has been involved one-on-one with us, from imagining us to creating us. And having a plan for us even before we were born. We are not here by chance, folks. We are not a mistake or an accident. We're not a lucky kind of guess. We have been planned, and God has a purpose for each and every one of us. And God continues his work in us. Do you know, we might take twists and turns in God's plans and purposes for us. I kind of dare say we will take twists and turns in God's purposes for us. We might miss the path. We might find ourselves lost from time to time, but God comes after us. God looks out for us. God doesn't just form us, step back, and walk away. Thank God. His interest in us didn't end at our creation. It's ongoing. God is interested in your life now. Remember that all the days ordained for you are known by God, and were known by God before any one of them came into being. Such is his knowledge. I know some of you will know the story of the pipe organ that was in bits. It had once been a beautiful pipe organ, but now it lay in bits in someone's room. And the person who owned it, the person who acquired it, longed for it to be built, to be good again. And so he drafted in all kinds of famous organ builders to come and to work on these bits. And people came from far and wide and had a go, but none of them could bring it back to its former glory. Not one of them. But then he got a knock at his door, and there stood a frail, elderly man. He didn't know him. He didn't recognize him. And the man said, I understand that you would like someone to rebuild an organ. And he said, I would. The guy said, can I try? And the fella said, well, what makes you think you can do what all of these famous people have not been able to do, all of these skilled people have not been able to do? He said, well, just give me a go. Let me try. And so he did. What did he have to lose? Time and energy, days and weeks passed. And that little old man built that organ back to its former beauty. And the guy was just marveling at it, but said, how come you could do what no one else was able to do? And he said, it's quite simple. I was the one who planned and built it in the first place. Just as an inventor follows the progress of his or her work, so God follows the progress of God's creation, of you and of me. Whether we acknowledge it or not, regardless of where we go or what we do or what we don't do, regardless actually of our mistakes, God doesn't decide to extract himself from us. He's there and waiting and ready to continue his work within our lives, whether we feel like an organ in bits in a corner of a room somewhere that needs to be completely remade, completely rebuilt, or whether we feel we just need a bit of God's grace at work to help to shape us some more, to help to enable us to find that path where God would have us be. You know, we were singing, "Better is one day in your courts." I was just reflecting on those words as we were singing. And I just thought, you know, that speaks about the beauty of a heart-to-heart relationship with God, where there is nowhere we would rather be than in the courts of God. In other words, in the presence of God. There is nowhere we would rather be than in that deep awareness of God's presence. But so often the stuff of life pushes that out. And before we know it, before we realize, we find that we're distant from God and we wonder why. And I guess the question is, have we prioritized our walk with God? Does that take first place in our lives? Or do we allow all kinds of other things to get in the way? Because if we don't prioritize that relationship with God, then before we know it, we'll be distant. Before we know it, when I ask the question, do you believe God continues his work in you? You'll probably respond, well, no, I don't believe that. I'm speaking to myself here. Maybe I'm speaking to some of you as well. David is the one who is attributed to have written the majority of the Psalms we find in our Bible. I love the Psalms. You know that I do. I've said that before. But you know, every now and again, David does something and you think, oh man, David, why have you done that? Why did you? This is one of the Psalms. It's so beautiful. Up to verse 18, you know? And then we get the next bit. I'll read on. Oh, that you would kill the wicked, O God, and that the bloodthirsty would depart from me. Those who speak of you maliciously and lift themselves up against you for evil. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies. And then we kind of get a little bit of a nicer part to the psalm again, but with a challenge, you know, with a bit of a sting in the tail. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me and lead me in the everlasting way. When we come to that bit of the, oh God, I wish you'd kill those who are horrible and all that kind of thing, I'm paraphrasing now. Actually, what we see David doing is expressing, I think, his desire to be rid of the wrong influences, the stuff that would detract from God. Those who speak of God maliciously, those who don't get who God is, those who don't live according to God's ways. David is in a sense saying, I don't want anything to do with that, because I know that that will not lead me to a closer walk with God. Indeed, the reality is that would have led David, in fact, the opposite direction, away from God, away from God's ways, away from God's will. He doesn't want to spend time or thought on that which leads away from God. Are there things that you and I are spending time on that lead us closer to God's heart? Are there things that we are spending time on at the moment that lead us further away from God's heart? Think about what you've spent your time on this week, and I'll do the same. Those things led you closer to God or further away? David's desire is that he is living as God intends. And so this psalm finishes with David asking God, God, know my heart, know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me. God, lead me in the way everlasting. God, that is what I want in my life, David's saying. Test me and know me. Lead me in your ways. So as we end our little series on this psalm, just like to ask you a few questions to reflect on maybe through this week. How often do you remember for yourself, that God has been interested in you even before you were born, and he is intensely interested in you now? He really is. How could this knowledge of God's interest in you begin to shape your life more and more from today? How could it shape your thinking? How would it shape your actions? How would it shape your walk with God? And God continues his work in us. But my experience of that is God continues his work in us most fully when we are open to God doing so, when we make ourselves available for God to do that. I guess it's part of God's ongoing creation of who we are. As we journey closer and closer to the people God would have us be, God continues his creation within us, leading us, guiding us. So I wonder what God's challenge is to you this evening from this psalm. I wonder what God's challenge to me is this evening. May we hear God speaking to us. God who is in our midst, week 1. God who knows us, week 2. God who continues his work in us, week 3.